What's up, everyone? I'm Nathan Graham Davis, and I'm going to re-break in as a Hollywood screenwriter.
The biggest lie ever told in Hollywood was just write something great and great things will happen. That's absolutely not true.
Hell of an intro, right? You know, a recurring theme in this whole thing seems to be just how hard this game is. And that makes me feel a little more sane, at least, like maybe I wasn't making things up when I walked away from all of it several years ago. But, you know, every single person that I've had on so far has had a lot of struggles and challenges and heartbreaks along the way, but every single one of them has found a way to push through it all. So it's doable. I just have to remember to stay driven and focused when times get tough. It's week 6 right now, which means I'm outlining, sort of. Actually, I'm mostly just working on my scratch doc and digging into my characters and having a lot of fun researching, but the structure and the story are starting to take shape, and that's really cool. Because I'm going to be outlining for 3 weeks, and because outlining is such an extremely personal thing, I thought it would actually be really cool to have a mini sub-series on the process. So for 3 weeks, I'm going to be interviewing a different writer every single week and just getting their take on outlining. First up is Joe Johnson. He's an amazing writer and producer who's got credits in both film and TV. We dug into how he approaches structure and how he finds his characters, what he thinks about voice, and just some really fun tangents on the business itself. Check it.
Dude, how are you doing? It's obviously been a wicked long time.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm trying to remember the last time we saw each other in person. I get in my brain, it's like events are like so long ago, it's confused. Like, I mean, I remember.
It would have been 16, I think, maybe 15 even. It was a while ago.
Yeah.
So I had just written that script, The Continuum.
Right.
I don't know if you remember that one. That was that time travel one.
Yeah, I mean, that one, because I remember I tried to get my manager at the time to take a look at it. It was like, he fucking didn't even read it because he was just like, oh, time travel's hard.
That was what happened with that script. I got like 6 referrals from different, WGA writers like yourself. And every single referral, they were like, nah, we're already doing time travel, or it's played out, or it's hard to do. So I didn't even really query on it much. I just kind of let that one die. And that was kind of the last frustration that just completely made me kind of give up on things for a while. And I had already kind of been there because I was unrepped and had walked away to do a graphic novel before that.
Right, I remember that. And what frustrated me about that most of all was like, I mean, how long would it take to even just read 10 pages and be like, okay, maybe this guy's a good rep? Because, when reps are reading material, they shouldn't just be reading it as, is this a piece of property they act like, so many of them act like real estate agents, right? It's like, can I sell this piece of property? Which sure. I get to an extent, and that's what you need to be. But if it's an unwrapped writer and somebody who you already represent, who I honestly never, there were 2 people I referred to that particular manager, and he didn't even read yours. And there was another person who I referred who I think read one thing and maybe even met with her in past. And like, he's probably looking at all the shows she's booked now going, oh, damn.
Really? Yeah. I mean, it's all good. It just is what it is. And honestly, that script is still relatively unseen. So although I'm writing a completely new one right now, I don't mind the fact that, I've got a second script that I really feel great about that'll be ready to go,
Yeah, I think it's in your back pocket.
But, I appreciated that referral. Thank you very much for throwing that out there anyway. Like I said, it's not that big of a deal. It never went anywhere. I kind of regret that I walked away for so long and have been completely out of it, but I'm glad to be getting back to it and kind of excited about it. The funny thing is, how you were just saying how reps are kind of looking for something that they can sell. I've been having that conversation with so many people lately, kind of like, I've put a lot of effort into figuring out what I'm going to write. And ultimately decided I'm going to go all in on something that I'm just truly excited about. And I don't know how saleable it is. I'm basically writing the Sorcerer's Apprentice meets the Witch. So it's not a super expensive movie, but it's not a cheap one. It's not a $2 million movie. Probably I could see it winding up at around like 10, 15, you know? But I'm really pumped about it. Like, I'm really excited about the idea, and everything is just, you know, flowing right now. So, you know, I'm going to go with it. But I wanted to talk to you and kind of get some of your insight on how you outline things, because that's what I'm about to dive into right now. And just kind of, I'm curious about your process, because I don't think, you know, you and I have talked plenty of times, but I don't think I've ever talked about that side of the craft with you at all.
Yeah, I'm not much of a, like, you know, there are some people who are really tied to their process, right? They have to have a log line first, and then they have to have like a 1 page, then they have to have a 3 page, and then they go in and outline it and whatever. And there's a lot of questions, you know, that people put on things. I tend to approach things first as like I've also realized, you know, earlier in my career, talking about the idea of being put in boxes, or you know, writing to a specific thing, right? You have a script that goes out and gets heat, so you have to write 3 more that are the same, so that the reps can say, oh, I'm selling you as this guy or that guy. And as you know from reading a couple of my, that I don't necessarily stay in one box a lot, but also part of that is, as a writer, I'm very not only genre hopping, but like my process is different for every script. So there have been scripts where I didn't start writing it until I had the whole story written out. There are scripts where I have a character or an idea, and I write 30 pages of just scenes that don't necessarily end up in the movie. That's sort of an outline in a way, because I'm just trying to find who is this character and how does this character operate in this world that I'm creating. Okay, now I got it. Now I can go back to the beginning and start over, and then start. But I often will write pages first, scenes, just to figure out who my character is and where they are in the world. And then I'll stop and go outline. And sometimes I've plowed forward. Like, I don't know if you ever read that script Cold that I wrote, which
I did.
A lot of back and forth in terms of the time narrative, and there was a little bit of a palindrome effect to some of the stuff. That was one where I didn't necessarily outline on paper, but
you didn't outline that?
I had note cards on.
Okay.
And we lived in a house that had this massive mirror in the dining room area. That was like, it was perfect for outlining or putting.
Did you put note cards up against the mirror so that you could kind of see it in reverse? Like,
no. It was just the panels. It was like panels of glass wood. So it created these natural panels. And you can write on it with a Sharpie as well, right? And then just wipe it off with alcohol. So I'm like writing on the mirror with Sharpie, putting up note cards, and then moving them around. That one was really interesting because, again, there was shifting forward, backwards, which scenes were in which order. But yeah, so that was a difficult, but I honestly probably wrote half the script, then stopped, then went and started putting up note cards. I was like, okay, here's what I have. Where do I need to go? And, you know, it worked for that script. You know, the script that you just read this past week, the first draft of that was 185 pages. And
wow, dude.
My outline process for that was, and, you know, some of that was autobiographical. So I wrote a bunch of like scenes. I wasn't sure what order they would go in the movie, because taking something like that, that's a slice of life, talk about execution dependent, right? Like there's no hype.
Yeah, totally.
Was what are the scenes from this boy's life in this period of time that I'm going to show, and then you know, having in that particular one, which involved around a Pac-Man tournament and the kid winning the Pac-Man tournament, that gave it a natural framework, right? So you're going to be like, you got to introduce it, then you got to have the qualifying rounds, and then of course the third act is going to be the final
tournament. It gave you a structure to hang it on, for sure.
Right. And that's generally what I try to do is like, once I find my character and once I find the world that they're in and I'm comfortable with that, so that I feel like I can write a first act, like, right, first acts are always easy until you have to write the second and third act and then make sure everything, you know, like the old axiom, if you have a third act problem, it's probably a first act problem.
Yeah, I was thinking about that today, actually. And you know, like just kind of thinking about, you know, why is that? Why is the first act so easy to write? And I think that the reason is because what you've done for your brain is you've kind of created these limitations so that your brain can actually focus on a specific story in a way where it allows for all of these ideas to come out, right? And so you're just ready to go. But then by the end of the first act, you've now boxed yourself into, you know, it has to go in some specific direction and you have to let that play out. And that's why it suddenly gets really hard. You know?
Exactly. And first acts are fun and can be easy just because, again, that's where you're finding the characters, you're finding the world, you're creating this situation that they're going to exist in. And it's a lot easier. Like, I'm trying to think of a good example. You know, like take a movie, like, again, if you want to take a drama, forget about, like, action movies are a lot easier. I don't mean easy in terms of saying it's easy to write them, but easy to see where the action's going to go, right? Like something like, you know, Die Hard, you know, sure. It's that escalating, you know, you create the problem, our hero recognizes the problem, our hero has to solve the problem. Something like Good Will Hunting, which is, you know, kind of an interesting story in the sense that it's a love story ultimately, right? Like that's the big, like, you know, everybody always said, oh, you know, the one piece of advice Wim Golden gave to Ben Affleck and Matt Damon was, it's about a boy and a girl, because they, in their original draft, had written a more action-oriented.
Right, hadn't it been like a spy thriller?
Thriller, yeah, man on the run kind of thing. And so, but think about that. Genius boy, works as a janitor at a college, and he comes from a poor neighborhood. I mean, that's easy. Again, I say easy, but nothing's easy. But you can see how you can write that 20, 30 pages of that setup.
Sure.
But now, you know, and how does that inform everything that happens? And how does everything that happened tie back to that? That's where it gets tricky. So yeah, when you come up with a new idea, you're like, I see all these limitless possibilities, and you spill them all out in the first act. And then you're like, wow, I maybe took too long to do some of these things, so now I got to cut them, or I didn't take long enough to do these other things, and so now I got to adjust them.
Well,
and
it's funny that you say that, especially about Pac-Man, because, you know, I had read that knowing that I wanted to talk to you about the stuff in particular, and especially I wanted to talk to you about kind of how you structure first acts, because that's, you know, I'm going to be doing an outline over 3 weeks for this thing, so it just makes sense to kind of beginning, middle, end, right? And I'm reading this and thinking, holy shit, he has layered in so many different types of conflict into this first act. I mean, you could just feel these setups that could explode in so many different directions, and it felt incredibly intentional. And it was really smooth. And so I just assumed, like, you must have had a really rigorous outline for that, but that's not how you found that, huh?
No, and I'll tell you on that one, part of how I found that script and why it was 185 pages in the first draft was because I just slammed it wall to wall with voiceover. And the voiceover was like Holder, you know, it was sort of telling me where I needed to go with the script. So it gave me, in a script like that, it was the perfect type of script to do that.
Totally. Yeah, you can, I mean, like I said, it had that kind of Stand By Me feel to it. And I really meant that. I mean, it felt like it was in the hands of this storyteller, and it worked really well.
And so when I say the first draft was 185 pages, and then the next draft was 130 pages, all of that was cut was, I mean, I did cut some scenes, but a lot of it was just cutting out because there was so much voiceover just telling, it was to tell, I was the only one who saw that draft, right? So it was to tell myself where I needed to go and what I was doing. And in the way that was a sort of outline within the script as I was going. So the voiceover was telling me where to go, and I was writing it. And that made it easy. Once I had all that voiceover, it was basically like writing a short story, telling myself where the script needed to go. Then I wrote the scenes around the voiceover and then pulled the voiceover out. And so that's down. But yeah, the first act was really difficult on that script because there's so many characters and, like you said, so many different setups. And in fact, the draft that initially went out once my manager had signed off on it and everything didn't even have, like, the Casey character, for instance, who's the older girl that he meets. She actually didn't appear until much later. And some of the stuff with the stepdad was pushed a little. And I looked back at it after it had gone out and I was like, wow, I actually didn't do enough in this first act to really set all this up, and then moved, even though I got a lot of great responses, and then I moved stuff back around. So what you just read was a more updated version that actually hasn't been seen by anyone. But yeah, it was.
Well, thanks for sharing it. I really enjoyed it. Are you going to do anything with that, or?
I mean, we'll see. You know, it's look. You know, this business, right? You know, when I first wrote that script, you know, it was like my manager sent it out on his own. I didn't have an agent at the time. And you get the call from CAA saying, you know, pull it off the market so we can give it to Steven Spielberg. And you're like, what? He's not going to make this movie. What are you talking about? And then they're like, no, we're going to give it to him. And then Steven Spielberg passed. And then it's like, okay, now pull it off. And, you know, wait, give us a couple more weeks. We want to give it to J.J. Abrams. And I'm like, okay, sure. You know, but then nothing happens. And it's like that was a gamble that we took, was like, take it off the market for these exclusive reads, but then it happened to be right at the holiday period, and then the holidays come, and then it's just, you know, we had, and then I did sign with an agency and we had plans for it, but just, you know, this is a very fickle business, and 1 minute certain things happen and the next minute it's just like all gone. It's so ephemeral, you know?
Yeah, it is. It can be brutal. I mean, again, that's kind of why I walked away, right? You know, I mean, there were just, I was shocked at the things that could happen that could just completely derail a project, you know? So, and I only saw it for a couple of years. You know, you've been doing this for a very long time, so I'm sure you've got war stories upon war stories.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, and that script was just almost like I don't know, like sort of, yeah, all the different stories that I have. That one was just funny. The funniest part about that was we had actually gotten a pass from the executive at Bad Robot, but had set up a meeting. And then J.J. Abrams' agent called my manager directly and said, oh, I'm going to get this to J.J. And we were like, yeah, but so-and-so over at Bad Robot already passed. And the agent said, I don't care if she passed. She decides what the company does. I decide what J.J. does. And I'm telling him to read this script. And I was like, okay. So I'm sitting there in the meeting with this woman, and she says, so what's happening with the script now? And I'm like, down the hall, I'm like, yeah, we pulled it off the market for an exclusive read. Oh, for who? And I'm like, I'm not sure I'm supposed to say. Like, your boss?
That's pretty awkward. So, yeah. But that's, yeah, I mean, so obviously people loved it then, right? I mean, like, if you have exclusive reads for the top names in the business, that certainly says something.
And that's all great, but I always remember when I very first started, another writer said to me, you know, you want to do your best work and you don't want to get cynical, but at the same time, as a professional writer, it's more important to get paid than it is to get compliments. Sure. And so, you know, compliments are great, and it's great when your work is validated, but the best validation is actually, you know, getting paid to push the work forward and ultimately get it on screen, you know? I mean, it's always been this way, where this business is much like the rest of the world and, you know, the banking industry or anything else. The top 1% control so much.
Sure. Yeah.
You know, for guys like us, like I'm one of those writers who's just, I've had hot moments. I've had really fallow moments. I've had years where I didn't do anything. But I've always just been able to keep going and get along, you know, both in TV and in film. And it's, you know, one of the things that, again, just to reiterate what some of your other conversations have been about, it's that persistence and that you keep going. And even if you take a break, there's no reason you can't jump back, especially these days. So there is always opportunity. to jump back in, you know, and reinvent yourself, which is why what you're doing, especially with full intention, is great. I mean, I've been there, I've done that. In fact, in 2006, I basically stopped writing for probably 3 years. And that was a series of different things, personal things. My mom passed away, my dad passed away, my last living grandparent passed away. Then my wife got pregnant, my daughter was born, and then the 2007 strike happened. So it was like, that was 12 months of my life, losing my parents, having a child, and then the strike happening. And my wife had a good job. And so I was like, yeah, I had deals that just disappeared with the strike. It was, you know, a tough time. And so I was like, forget it. Why am I gonna do this? But like you know, it was like, that's all I wanted to do. And so a couple years go by and I was fine being a stay-at-home dad and doing that. And I'm like, but I want to keep writing. I don't want to not write. And so, you know, it's like another reinvention, boom, coming back in. So it's, you know, it can be done. Like, you know, when you've been doing this for a long time, you forget, you kind of get caught up in it. There's moments where like I look around and I'm like, you know what? I don't know the stats off the top of my head, but I know the stats about how many people get into the guild and how long they stay in the guild are really not great, you know?
Yeah, they're not. Yeah.
People fall out. People don't get second jobs. I look at like, you know, like I said, I had a pretty good run in my 20s of getting TV episodes and whatever, and, you know, did some, but things I've had optioned that didn't get made, things I've worked on that did get made, you know, it's like, I look around, I'm like, I actually have, you know, a decent amount of work, more than, you know, it's funny because you're always comparing yourself to bigger, better writers, right? And the reality in terms of the general populace, I'm ahead of the game, you know? So it's like, I have to remind myself that, like, don't get cynical, because again, I've been lucky in a lot of things, but I've also worked really hard. And, you know, so I've been able to pick up credits here and there, but also just work. And, you know, what I'm really bad at is networking and like asking other people for favors and following up on that. And that's, you know, I'm just not a good salesman. And that's one of the things that you really, really need to be now, because you're not gonna, and I know everybody's gonna say, oh no, my agent's great or my manager is great, but on the whole, you cannot expect just to, like, the biggest lie ever told in Hollywood was just write something great and great things will happen. That's absolutely not true, because you need pieces to fall into place after you write something great. And, you know, you got to do a lot of that legwork and hustle yourself these days.
You know, it's funny you say that, because I've wondered, so, you know, in the 6 years that I haven't really been doing anything in the business, I've been in banking and in, you know, so my whole job is people. My whole job is, you know, I don't know if I would necessarily say my whole job is sales, but that's certainly a component of it. And also just working with people and developing relationships. And, you know, I'm curious if that'll play into things as I move forward this time, and if that'll be helpful to me, you know, just the skills that I've kind of gained along the way, just as a result of being in that world, you know?
I mean, it should. And you know what, listen, you'll see guys and women, you know, whose names pop up in the trades for selling pitches or selling this or selling that, but then never get a movie made. Or maybe only get one here or there. It seems like they're crushing it because they're probably a good writer, but they're also probably really personable and great to talk to in a room. Because as much as you hear horror stories about Hollywood, and yeah, there are some real jerks out there and whatnot, the reality is nobody wants to, as much time as it takes to put a package or project together, nobody wants to spend that time with an asshole. Nobody wants to spend that time with somebody who's rude or condescending. And so when you see those people get ahead and you say, how did that guy, you know, that guy's such a jerk. I mean, I tend to think they're generally the exception. Yeah, I'm not going to pretend like Hollywood is the most ethical, like happy playground in the world. But also at the end of the day, most of the people, like, and when I say most, I mean like, if you're doing a scale of 1 to 10, I mean like more than 80%, more than 90% even, who I've had meetings with and have just been like decent people who want to
that's
find
been my experience. Absolutely. You know, even like, you know, in the situations where I've been really frustrated at things that have fallen apart, I've always enjoyed the people, you know?
Yeah.
So
it is a very, like, that's the thing. Hollywood is a very, you know, people first, sociable thing. And so you do get, you know, writers who are like, I'll tell you an example of a story though. Like, so I went and I pitched on an adaptation of a book at a, well, I guess I probably shouldn't say because it was too recent, but at a very well-known company, you know, and big time, who has their own financing, you know, and they had read actually Pac-Man as a sample, and this was a project that involved a young boy and an adventure, and you know, had a really great meeting, and the execs I met with, really great feedback, had a, you know, what I thought was a solid pitch. And then, you know, they said, oh, we passed, you know, it's down between you and one other person. And they passed. And the other person that got the job was somebody who has no professional credits, but is a stand-up comic. And so probably had a pretty good sample, because I'm going to assume that he got in the room by having a good writing sample. But it's like, I'm fine talking to people and whatever, but I know if you're going up against a seasoned performer,
sure, somebody's just got you laughing your ass off in the room.
So. The job, that can be very frustrating sometimes, because you're like, I wrote a really good sample and I came up with a really good pitch, but then, you know, somebody comes in who's really good in the room. You know, I recognize I have my limitations when it comes to that stuff. And so, you know, it's something I've been trying to work on as I've gotten older. You know, hopefully I'll figure it out soon. But, you know, some people pitching is much more natural than others. And so they, you know, they nail it. To pull it back to the creation of an idea, to then like what's next, and how do you go from that creation of an idea to a script. I'll give you a perfect example, something I'm working on right now. Okay, so I read this story and it sparked an idea in me about, you know, oh, is there a movie somewhere hidden in this story? It was like a one-page newspaper article. And so then I was like, I had this other idea kicking around in my brain for years and years. And I was like, well, can I marry those two ideas? And so it's not so much an outline, but just thinking about like, so then I do some research on the two different things and where's the overlap in there? So in a lot of ways, that's how I begin my outlining process, as much as I have one, is by research, and not necessarily saying, what is this specific story beat, but what are the general overall sort of elements that exist in the story in these characters. Okay, so now I've got this world. I've got world A and world B, and I've found a way to tie them together. But to do that, I need this character. Okay, so now how do I get from this character to who's going to be our main characters? And then so I start sketching them out. And then, so it's almost like making a word cloud of ideas, you know? And so then once I have, okay, now I know this is the main character, and this is main character number 2, and this is the antagonist character, and this is the backstory of the antagonist character, and this is the backstory of the main character. And now I've got the world and I've got the setting. What happens? When you mix that all together, what are the natural things that happen? And those first few things are really easy to say, like, oh, these are the first natural things that are going to happen.
Right.
Okay. And that's why writing a first act starts to come fun. You know, like I whipped out 30 pages of that sucker in a couple of days, but now I'm on page 30 going like, okay, now I probably need to rewrite 26 of those pages, but need the ideas that carry forward. But it's like, that's, to me, that's like, it's almost like cooking. You know, I'm figuring out the ingredients and putting them together. And so that's why I say I notice not to formally outline it when I start. I start first, and then when I get to my first corner that I'm not sure how to get out of, that's when I stop, look at what I have, say, which of this can I keep? But what really do I need to carry forward? And then I push forward from there. And then I will do more of a sort of beat sheet, pushing forward, or cards, because if I think there's sometimes I just write it on note paper. Sometimes I write it on cards and pin it around. So like you can see the wall behind me is totally blank. Like
yeah.
I tend not to put up any artwork or anything because I leave the wall blank in here so that when I do want to start taping up cards, I tape up cards.
Okay.
And
cool.
I do cards as much, if not more, than actually writing out beats, just because that was how I learned doing it in television initially.
Yeah, I've done cards a lot in the past, and I also use notebook paper sometimes. Like I'll just draw like 3 lines across a notebook paper, so I've got kind of 4 acts basically there, and just kind of start putting scenes in across the board. But you know, so one thing that I noticed as you've been talking about this, and even before kind of we got back to outlining, was just you continue to talk about needing to kind of understand your characters before you move forward.
Right.
So, which makes total sense because, you know, characters are obviously the driving force of a story. What do you feel like you need to understand about your characters before you're actually diving in?
Well, it's a good question. I'm trying to think of another example. Okay, so like a different project that I'm working on, involves a guy who's been released from prison and trying to regain parental rights to his child. So for me, I like to, you know, ground as much in reality as I can from the beginning. So I can't tell you how much I read about, and it's like, I'm specifically setting this in Oklahoma. So I went and read all the laws on child custody of incarcerated people in Oklahoma, and when do you lose your rights and how do you lose your rights? Can you get them back? What happens? All that stuff. So there's like, you know, I remember when I read Stephen King on writing, he said, oh, you know, research after the fact, you know, just make it up. And I think there's an extent to which I do that, but then there's an extent to, like you said, informing the character where I need to know a little bit about what's the reality of this, even though we're making a movie that's not, it's fiction, right? But I want to know a basis in reality. What's the real world like, so I can break the real world rule,
Sure.
right? Like, you know, even something like, if I was writing a Fast and Furious, right? Okay, so I forget which number it was, 7 or 8, where they're dragging a safe around the city on the car. I mean, I would have at least looked up how much does that safe weigh? What's the torque on this vehicle? Just to how far beyond the realm of physics am I going?
Right. Is it even, you know, in the realm of possibility? No, I'm totally the same way. You know, you know, all those books back there on that shelf are all related to this project that I'm working on. And I'm not going to read all of those before I'm into my first draft, not even close, but I've already started picking through them, and I'm getting a ton of ideas for characters and beats and things like that, just from kind of digging into them. And then I will probably read them a lot more extensively kind of between drafts. You know, I'll do a draft and send it out to a couple people for notes, and I'll read a book or something, and that type of thing.
And so once I have that, like what I think is sort of a real world background of who a real world person of this might be, then I start to think, okay, now what's this person who I'm creating? And a good way to do that, and what I will do a lot oftentimes, is in the first act, when it's not really a first act, when I'm just writing, I will just write these big long monologues from my main characters, where they're either telling a story about their past, or because I feel like as in writing that, then I start to get more of okay, this is their voice, and they are, and this is where they came from. And it's just like a weird writing exercise. You know, I remember one script I wrote, like I heard some song, and the song just kind of evoked an image in my mind. And so I wrote this scene completely separate of anything else. I just wrote this scene between these two characters. And in writing this scene between these two characters, I was like, oh, this is who this character is going to be, and he's going to be my main character. And then so now I go back. And then a very short version of that scene ended up on like page 20 or something of that script.
Are you actually opening up like final draft and writing out the scene for real when you're doing that? Or are you just kind of jotting down notes? Or
it's a combination. Like a lot of times I will write a lot freehand beforehand. And when I write freehand, before I'm building out the scene, a lot of times what I'm doing in freehand, and that's why when I talk about how I wrote Pac-Man with a lot of that voiceover, a lot of times when I'm doing freehand, it's like, I don't spend a lot of time on the action. I'm writing the dialogue. And so that first pass of dialogue will often be a lot of tell that then gets put into the action as show, you know?
Sure.
So, you know, as an example, if I'm trying to figure out this character, it's like, he's talking about, you know, oh, like that scene I was talking about between two characters that was inspired by a song. Oh, when you went back to when you were in the army, you did this and you were this old. And these characters are telling things that you would never want to actually write in your final version of, but by writing that out, I'm finding their voice. How would they tell this story? Now I go back and I write the scene and it's like, I don't have to say he was in the army. You know, you do things like he's wearing dog tags or he's got his tattoo or whatever. And, or you mention it, but you don't have to talk about age because now you've established the character and you know how old the character is and things like that. So yeah, I'll write out a lot of dialogue that then as I go to retype it, that's when I start filling out the scene and shaping the dialogue so that when I'm typing, particularly the dialogue, that's the second time I'm writing it. I'm rarely writing for the first time on the computer unless I've just outlined, you know, a scene like and said, oh, this is what needs to happen in this scene. And I'm very, you know, I have a very clear image in my mind of what needs to happen in this scene. Like, you know, I just, in this one script I'm writing right now, I know what the next scene is going to be. So I've written down some notes of what it's going to be. And that I'll just sit at the computer and type up. The other thing I'll do in Final Draft is I'll go to scene view and print that out. Have you ever done that where you can put like, we just have the slug lines in the first couple?
Yeah, I'm aware of that and I've never used it ever.
And so I use that. That's like almost an outline type thing because then you're at the whole scene and you're not looking at the dialogue. So then you can print that out and I'll cut that apart and tape it up and look at it. It's almost like cards, right? Like I know there's an index function card as well. So there's different functions in Final Draft, whether it's the cards or whether it's the scene view. So you can choose how much information. Sometimes I only want to see a little bit as I'm looking at the whole thing, and sometimes I want to see a lot. But I'll do that as I go along because then I'll say, you know, I've never written an outline and then written the script exactly as that outline.
Yeah, me neither. Like, you know, it's funny because I actually do outline extensively. You know, most of my outlines are probably, I don't know, 15 pages long or whatever. But I would say I probably lose 40, 50% of that along the way just because it evolves and changes.
And I think part of my not outlining so much in front is because of every television script I've ever written and working on, everything's been very detailed outlined because that's the way you have to do it. And there's
right. Yeah. You do a straight beat sheet. I mean, for TV where almost everything is there, right?
Yeah. And depending on your show and depending on the showrunner and depending on the studio, it can change and depending on what season the show is in. But typically on a first season show and usually with if the producers are into it, you know, like the show I was on last year, it was like an 18-page outline for, you know, what's basically a 45-minute episode.
Yeah, that's a lot.
Everything's broken out as a team in the room. You have all the cards, you take the cards down, the writer's assistant writes them up for you, and then, you know, you turn that into an outline, but you have every single beat of what's happening where. But also, this was a funny discussion we had in that television room because there were, you know, writers who had been on very different shows, and it's always, you have to know which showrunner you have. Do you have the showrunner who's going to get mad when you turn in an outline that's exactly the cards that were on the board? Or do you have a showrunner who's going to get mad if you deviate from the cards? Some showrunners want you to find surprises in the process and give them back an outline that's a little different than what you broke in the room, or at least have surprises in it. And some showrunners just want you to put back what they discussed in the room, and if there's changes to be made, they'll make them.
So you got to actually understand what they're looking for before you even dive into that.
Right. And so that's how I learned how to write,
Sure.
You know, initially in television, those first several years. And then so as I've done, once I started doing features, it's always felt more like a playground open possibilities to me. I love the structure of television, and being part of a staff is great because, you know, it's always back, like, you can take chances, especially if you feel safe in your staff. You can take chances and realize, like, if I whiff, there's somebody right there who's going to be like, no, that doesn't work. You know, when you're writing a feature, you're off on your own. You know, I've written some stuff, I'm like, yeah, look at this scene. And then I go show my wife, and my wife's just like, dude, no. And it's like, oh, okay. I guess that didn't work as well as I thought it did, you know?
I mean, it happens every time. I've never written a first draft of something where somebody hasn't pointed out something that was glaringly bad and I should have seen from the start. But it happens every time for some reason.
Well, and again, that's what outlining and first drafts are for. It's that exploration, right?
So for your Pac-Man script, you had a structure that was based around this Pac-Man tournament, right? And you kind of, when you understand that structure, you can just intuitively see how at least the general movie is going to follow that structure and it's going to carry it. Do you normally have something like that to start with, a structure that it's going to hang on, or do you find that along the way?
No, and in fact, that movie specifically was a series of scenes between the little boy JJ character and his grandfather. And those scenes came about just because one of the things that I just talk about how much conflict and how much was in the script. One of the things that I didn't bring up at all in the script was the fact that my grandfather did live with, like, that all part was true. He lived with us when I was younger. He really did die because he had a heart attack when he was in the car, and the heart attack didn't kill him. It was that he got hit by a bus because he stepped on the accelerator and the bus ran through his car and broke his neck.
God, dude.
But he was, so, like, if you look on his birth certificate, he's classified as Negro because that's how they did it back then. But both of his parents were the grandchildren of slave owners. And so both of his parents were both mixed. So he was a very light-skinned Black man. And so the funniest part about all of that was that my wife was the one who kept telling me, so when I was younger, my mom was working all the time. I was staying with him, and she kept saying, oh, you should write these stories about your grandfather. You're always telling me, blah, blah, blah. And for years she kept telling me, and she's like, you can call it Blackish. And then that show came out. And then because, that was the original idea, was telling this story about this boy and his light skin, I went everywhere, like all day. It was just me and my grandfather. And, listen, is LA, is Southern California, but it was still the early 80s. He got looks sometimes, and it's like, what's that guy doing with that little white boy, that script started out just, really was more about those scenes, but there was no structure to it. There was just scenes. And I had written a few scenes between the JJ character and the grandfather character. And then I remembered my brother doing this Pac-Man thing. And so I was like, well, that could be actually the structure around this. And then the characters evolved. And so the grandfather character, as much as that started as, and that's why I kept him in it the way I did. But a lot of those scenes fell away is because the relationship between JJ and Casey became more important. And again, finding the character, I realized that as much as JJ was the main character, he was not the character who was doing stuff. He was the character who was facilitating other people doing things, so became the magic wanderer or whatever you want to call it, but yeah, so that definitely evolved from once I figured out which character. So it wasn't just about, that's the other thing. It's not just about any individual character. It's about the relationships, because all drama and tension and conflict in the script is about relationships, right? Ultimately, it can't just be about winning a Pac-Man tournament. It can't just be about, even Die Hard. It's not just about stopping the terrorists. It's about husband and wife reuniting. For my script, it was about, each of those people moving on in their own unique ways, and the people who couldn't, didn't have good outcomes. But that is the next step. It's who, once you get the character, then what are the important relationships that those characters are going to experience? And everything else around it is, I mean, like you said, it's expected, right? If you say there's a script or a movie about kids in a Pac-Man tournament, you kind of automatically know, okay, there's beat. Like, think of a movie like Dodgeball. They're going to form the team. They're going to go through qualifying. They're going to go to the finals. But that's not what the movie's about. That's just the structure, right?
Right.
So this script with the Pac-Man tournament, it's not about the Pac-Man tournament. Pac-Man tournament is just a way to keep it structured and keep it moving in each of those acts. But really, there's more important things happening in each act that just happen around the tournament.
And so is that common for you to find the structure later on in the process?
Yeah, I think so. I think, you know, some are more evident than others. Again, like bringing up Cold, you get people who are so, you know, there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. They're going to get stranded. There's going to be some shit that happens in the middle, and there's going to be a rescue. Or is there going to be a rescue? Or who's going to, you know, and so, and that was another one inspired by true life. You know, I'd read a story about a couple that got stuck, and it's like, you know, you think about, oh, is that anachronistic to be like, oh, in modern day saying somebody takes a wrong turn on a road and gets stuck in the snow. And yet every year I read more stories about it. It still happens because, I mean, unless you're carrying a sat phone with you, there's still areas where there's no cell service, and there's still, you know, people who think, oh, I can take this road even though I'm not supposed to, and then something happens. So that started from, okay, that was one where I was like, okay, so that's a concept. Now, who are the characters that inhabit this story? Who would that be? Naturally, it's going to be a couple. So some of those choices were a little odd, but then the way you make it interesting is then, okay, now who is each individual person? What is the conflict and dynamic in their relationship? Why is this interesting? We know certain things are going to happen in the story, but it's about how they happen and who they happen to.
It's actually really cool to hear how it works for you and how it all stems from character. That's really what I've been focusing on lately, is trying to dig into characters and let things develop from there. I've just been writing ideas down into a Google Doc, you know, and I've got 7 pages of single-spaced ideas right now. And, you know, mostly it's just coming from character. And I definitely will do a more rigorous outline and start on that in the next few days, probably. But I like your idea of just kind of writing some monologues and stuff like that. And I will probably be doing that myself for them to just kind of get into it. I think that that's pretty cool.
Right. I mean, again, like I said, it's all, you know, I remember somebody said to me once, and I don't know if it's true or not, if they had inside knowledge, or they were just making sort of a generalization, but something like Place Beyond the Pines with Ryan Gosling, right? Because you're like, how do you make, because here's the other thing about creating characters that are, you want them to feel real, but you want them to feel unique. How do you do that? Like, you know, familiar, but different, you know, that's always the mantra. But, you know, you have this opening scene where there's not even any dialogue, where Ryan Gosling's character is like smoking a cigarette, flipping his butterfly knife. He walks through the crowd. He hops on his motorcycle. He gets in this thing. It's like, that's a great introduction to, like, without even any dialogue, you just kind of get a real strong picture of this character and who he is and what his sort of, you know, mentality is, and all from that first couple of minutes without him even saying anything. And that's the kind of thing, like, you know, maybe those characters just spring into some writers' minds right away. Sometimes you need to find it. Maybe that's the 4th scene or the 5th scene you've written with that character, but then you realize that's the best way to introduce them. Because that's the other important thing is you can write a really good version of, okay, like whatever action movie you can come up with. But if the characters are bland and silly, then it's not going to spark anyone's interest. You know, I remember Malcolm brought up John Wick in his thing. And what's interesting about John Wick is how, you know, Derek originally wrote that as a 65-year-old guy who was totally retired. And then it, you know, got in the process.
You know, he based that off of his uncle, right? Like,
right. And I think John Wick was his grandpa's name or something. Like, but
well,
yeah,
that's what I was thinking. Maybe it was his grandpa, but yeah, it was based off of like he pulled
right.
it from, you know, a relative.
But that's what gave authenticity to that character, even though then it got altered down to Keanu. But the reality of it was, you know, look, these aren't game-changing, groundbreaking alterations to the character, but they were interesting enough. So it wasn't just, you know, random hitman, just robotic guy. It, you know, really in those first opening pages, you set up, here is a guy who is responsible for the death of a lot of people and, you know, other people's loss. But when he has to deal with all of this tremendous loss, I mean, because it's universal, and that's the thing. That's where it's familiar. We all grieve at some point in our lives. We all lose somebody, and we all deal with grief in our own special way. And so with John Wick, it's like this ultimate, like, you know, hey, wouldn't it be cool if when I was grieving and when I was upset, I had the ability to just go fucking punish everybody who made me that way, you know? And so having, you know, the insult to injury with his car getting stolen and the dog getting killed was just, that was like a step too far for the John Wick character. But again, audiences could be like, I know that grief. I understand that grief and feeling helpless. But what if I didn't feel helpless, you know? And so that's when the fantasy of a movie hero comes to life. But that's what makes a script stand out, right? Is that you have a character who really speaks to the audience in some way, you know, and that's what's going to make producers and agents and managers be excited, because they know that they can then get the talent. You know, I can't tell you how many times I've read a script or written a script myself, even where, you know, I've gotten good feedback and it's like, but, you know, the character, you know, just doesn't, this might be tough to cast. And I'm like, okay, well, that's a failure on my part as a writer. When, you know, if you're not writing a character that people can be like, oh, wow, I can cast this, you know, then that's tough. Like,
so they're saying it might be tough to cast, not because of the specific demographics of this person, but because they can't see somebody being in that role.
Well, that too, but no, it's about how enticing is the role, right? And if you look at the roles that, like, the actors who get movies made, there's always something interesting about it, like Deadpool, you know. I'm sure that was probably a risky thing to take on, but I'm sure there's probably 20 actors who are like, damn, I wish I had done that, you know?
Oh, totally.
Deadpool's great. He's not gonna win an Oscar for that role. But again, there's gonna be a ton of actors who are like, I'd love to do that role, you know?
Sure.
So there's different ways to measure what's valuable to an actor, you know, because they want to have fun too sometimes, you know, but also they want to have roles that challenge them. The good ones do, you know, and look, of course, you're going to look at movies and be like, wow, why did so-and-so do this? Or what made him do that? Yeah, there's movies that studios put together and there's paychecks involved and things happen cynically, but you can never, what was it?
But that's not how you want to approach a spec, obviously.
Right.
So.
Terry Rossio, who said, you know, shit plus one is never good.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. He's got that column on Word Player, which is.
Yeah.
That's a great one. And I totally agree with that.
That way, you know. I remember a TV writer told me a story once, and again, this is an old timer story, but he said there was a guy who kept writing into, and I don't know if this was just Hollywood anecdote, what truth, but he kept writing into Barney Miller and complaining about the show was getting worse and worse and worse, and then finally he wrote in and he said, you know, you guys wrote another really terrible episode. I could have written an episode better than what was on TV last night. And finally the producer wrote back and he said, you know what? I bet you could have written something better than what was on television last night, but you can't write something better than what the writer originally turned in that was then noted to death by the studio, then noted to death by the network, then changed on set by the director. He was like, so just think about that. There's so much that happens between when
it's so true, man. You know, that's actually part of. So I got into screenwriting because I worked at a Blockbuster, and I was putting crappy movies on the shelves and saying, "Oh, I can totally do better than this." But you know, I very quickly realized how much harder it was, and then 7 years later, I broke in. So there you go.
Yeah, I mean, you cannot approach it as I'm gonna just do better than the worst last bad thing I saw or whatever. You really have to. And again, that's where the passion thing comes down, and you can't be cynical about it. And you can't look at, that's why, you know, I think there's always the advice of don't chase trends. I mean, you can try, you know, but if your passion's not in it, you're just trying to, there is a business aspect to writing for screenwriting that you have to be aware of, and you have to kind of, you know, pay attention to. But at the same time, that doesn't mean, oh, just because, you know, X movie came out, I'm going to go write the, you know, alt version of that I don't really care about, but I think will make money. You got to go write your version of that you care about, or just figure out what you really care about that could be next, you know?
So, you know, here I am, I'm writing a script a period piece that centers around two women, one of whom is over 60. So I don't know if it's the most marketable thing in the world, but I think the story is going to be pretty crazy and different and fun and unique. So I'm going to enjoy writing it. So there we go.
Yeah, and if you enjoy it, then, you know, hopefully that comes across. That's, you know, for me, having written in different genres, one of the things about the Pac-Man script I feel confident in saying is, like, you know, there's a certain feeling and a tone and an emotion that comes across in that script, but that's because it's, you know, so much of it is real in terms of my personal experience. And so it was as hard as it was easy to write, if that makes sense, you know?
Yeah, definitely.
It took me a long time to write just because I didn't want to. But then when I did, it was like, nobody else could have written some of those scenes the way I did. And that's the advice I know you're hearing from, I think Bob said a version of it, Malcolm said a version of it. It's like, you have to figure out what's your, you know, version of that. Perfect example, I happened to see a trailer. It just auto-played. I didn't even know what it was. And it's a movie called Spontaneous that Brian Duffield wrote and I think directed.
Oh, he's a great writer. I haven't seen this movie, but I remember when Jane Got a Gun was, you know, first circulating, just the script, and it's so good.
Yeah, and that was a departure from his normal style, which was
it really? Yeah, I think that's the only thing I've read from him, but I really remember enjoying it.
He had such a fun, interesting style. So that's what I was going to say. I saw like 5 seconds of this trailer and I was like, wow, that seems like that is the brand. Like, it was just like, you know, it was obvious. Nice. Because, you know, there are people who write that, like Charlie Kaufman is, you know, you talk about voice and talk about being unique. And there are some people who just have it in such a way that it's like, yes, you see a Charlie Kaufman movie and you're like, yeah, I get it. That's Charlie Kaufman. Aaron Sorkin, to a pretty good extent, just because of the way he writes his dialogue and structures his scenes, they pretty much as his own style. And there are other writers when, you know, you see and you see the consistencies and you see the voice, but there are other writers that are just good and you know, at what they do, like Steve Zaillian, who does all of these massive literary adaptations.
Yep.
I'm not sure, or Eric Roth, I'm not sure if like you put two side by side, I would automatically be like Zaillian, but like if you did and said, I'd be like, of course, because the quality is there. There's like a quality there more so than the voice that stands out. Like, you know, Duffield's voice stands out, but it's unique. But on the page, their writing is, if you've ever read go look at the script for Forrest Gump. You know, it's.
I've read that before. Yeah.
It's like, it's just like, you're like, how does he write something? It seems so simply written on the page, but everything is there, you know? And,
dude, I just read Whiplash the other day, and that was kind of the feeling that I had reading that. was frustratingly perfect to me.
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
I mean, just every beat was spot on. You know, the characters are so great. And, you know, we were talking about comparing yourself to other writers before, and I'm like, this motherfucker's a year younger than me. He made this like 6 years ago, and like so good. It's such an amazing script, such an amazing movie. And that's part of what I'm channeling actually for this script. So, because I've got this kind of apprentice situation and a really mean, hostile mistress. So I've been digging into that. But yeah, I mean, I totally get what you mean about the quality just standing out.
Yeah, and so even if it's not like, you know, so sometimes people just mistake voice. Like when I say Duffield has an excellent voice that stands out and you picture it, some people look at that and say, oh, well, you know, you mean he's gimmicky, or that? No, that's his authentic, like, you know, he's having fun when he's writing, and there's nothing wrong with that. Sort of like the way Shane Black, when he busted in, you know, like in the
totally
original Lethal Weapon, like his asides and breaking the fourth wall type stuff, you know, but that doesn't mean you have to do that to have voice. You just have to, voice is more than that. It's about writing a scene or a character or an overall story in a way that only you can. That's just different. Like if you gave 3 different writers the same outline and you got back scripts that were similar, then they're probably not great writers. They're probably just competent craftspeople. But the more varying degrees that the scripts evolve differently than the outline, that shows you voice of those writers. It's like, I remember the year after Get Out came out, and when I was taking meetings, every single meeting, I swear I must have had 100 meetings where every single person, you know, I always ask people, so what movie came out in the last year that you would make here, or that you wish you made? And Get Out was the answer, like 90-something% of the time.
Huh.
But I would bet big money most of those places would not have made Get Out before Get Out. You know what I mean?
Sure.
So they saw the success of it and the quality of it, and then afterwards wanted to mimic it and said, I want to find the next Get Out. But they didn't find the first Get Out. And that's my point, is you got to make the first Get Out, you know, because someone will make it, and then, you know, everybody will be wanting to copy you.
So I find myself really inspired by how organic Joe's process is. You know, it's pretty different than my own, but mine has always been this kind of evolving thing anyway. And what I like about what Joe does is he just kind of uncovers his story in this free-spirited way, and then he circles back to his outline and his structure. I'm never going to be somebody who writes 30 pages to find my story, but I did just write 5 of them, kind of trying out his method of having characters talk to each other. And, well, they actually came out really shitty. I realized that I have no idea what I'm doing. I have no idea how these characters are supposed to talk. They lived 6 centuries ago in a completely different culture. And I am starting to think that I was a little bit insane for taking on a script like this that requires so much research under a very public deadline. But here I am. You know, I was actually feeling really excited up until this point. I had this idea that I was stoked on. I generated pages and pages of notes and beats and story elements. And, you know, I bought a shitload of books. I have a writing playlist that I'm enjoying very much. And I just felt in the zone. And now I'm experiencing a whole lot of self-doubt. But, you know, I've been here before. I've been here on almost everything that I've ever written. And I've powered through with most of them. So I'm going to do the same with this one. And the upside of this exercise actually was that I do feel like I know my characters a whole lot better now. I can kind of visualize them. And, you know, I actually uncovered a need for my protagonist that I wasn't aware of before. And that's going to drive a ton of conflict and push the story forward. So that's actually really cool. So on that note, I'm ready to start outlining for real, which is exciting. For those of you doing this with me, here are the action steps for week 6. Number 1, as always, read a script. Read a script for a friend and give them the best notes that you can. In a few weeks, you're going to have a finished script of your own, and hopefully you'll have a good network of friends willing to give you some notes as well. Number 2, work on your scratch doc. I've spent at least 60 minutes every single day this week just working on my scratch doc, generating ideas, coming up with characters and beats and settings, and it's really starting to come together. So put the time in and it'll pay off. Number 3, do your research. The ideas in your scratch doc should help you figure out what you need to learn and where to invest your time. Do it now so that you feel ready to roll once you're starting to write your script. Number 4, make your characters talk to each other. Try putting them in a scene, add a little conflict, and see what happens. Number 5, study a movie in line with what you're writing. Read the script, watch the movie, and then break down the structure and see what you can learn from it. That's all I got for week 6, everybody. Thank you so much for checking this out. Just like every week, I'm going to be giving away a autographed copy of Malice and Mistletoe signed by Jack Purcell and by myself. Speaking of Jack, he's got a new podcast called Faces and Heels. So if you're into comics and wrestling and geeky shit like that, you should totally check it out. The link is in the show notes below. For this week, I'm just making it easy. I just mentioned that I have a writing playlist. I do this for every single project. It changes from project to project depending on the tone and the feel and whatever. This time I'm listening to mostly dark ambient stuff, including an artist called Dark Ambient. I'm also listening to The Haxan Cloak, which I'm pretty sure is the most unsettling music that has ever existed. I'm revisiting a metal band that I used to really dig back in the day. They're called Alluvietti, and if Orcs had a favorite band, that would be it for sure. Check it out if that's your type of thing. So for this week, I want you to comment below your favorite writing music. Let me know what you're into and give me some ideas for next time. I'll pick one of you and send you a copy of Malice and Mistletoe. And that's it. So again, thank you so much for checking this out. If you're getting value out of this show, please share an episode with a friend or share it on social media, on Reddit. I don't care where you share it, but please share it. And be sure to subscribe, because next week is part 2 of this outlining series with my good friend Martin Aguilera. It's sure to be a good one. Until next week, have fun writing. Smash cut to black.